Productivity. Gladiator.
I'm Brian Nelson Palmer. On this show, I share personal, practical productivity skills. And in this episode, we're talking about bridging generations, and it's the tactics for managing people that are older than you. Man, I've been really interested in this topic for most of my career because I've managed a lot of people that are older than me, and it's a challenge and an interesting new skill set. And with me on the show today is Kerian, who's a author, executive coach, and a consultant on this topic. Anne, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I do love this topic as well, especially with so many different generations in the workforce right now. It comes up all the time. It is, and it's going to be around for a long time too.
Say a bit about your background now and how it relates to our topic today.
And I get people calling me and asking me, I need somebody to come in and do some kind of motivational speech for my association, for my staff, whatever it may be. I'll say, what do you want them to learn? What do you want them to walk away with? And what are your pain points? And it almost always comes down to just the basic people getting along at work. And so then I'll talk about how many different generations do we have? Now that you say that, yes, we have a lot of different generations, and we have people who are retiring and they're supposed to be mentoring people coming in new. So it does flows to the top of a lot of topics that are chosen because it's across the board. This is not obviously isn't particular to any type of industry. It's everybody. We all have to get along at work, and it's not always easy.
There's a lot of folks that talk about leadership, and certainly other people who have talked about the topic of managing people from other generations or people older than you. So what would you say makes you a bit different from other folks who also do this?
Gosh, well, I've lived it. I'm on obviously the older end of the workforce now, which is very difficult for me to say, Brian. I can't believe it. So I'm just being honest here. I'm in my mid 50s, and I was once the young person that knew everything. I mean, I knew everything. You can even ask the people that worked with me at my first place of employment, which was a television station in Minot, North Dakota. My general manager at the time, Wayne Sanders, we had a conversation one time because I was always in his office with new ideas, or my news director's office. And he said, Ann, I just don't think life is ever going to go as fast as you want it. He's like, you just need to slow down. And I've been told that my whole life. So he was spot on. But I'm very disclosing about that. I'm not coming to you as somebody who knows everything and how to treat people, because a lot of times it was me who wasn't either treating people well or being treated well. And so I think the fact that I can come from all angles probably makes me a little bit more unique. Some people are, maybe on the younger end and they're just talking about how hard it is for them, or they're on the older end and they're saying, here's how you should treat us. I can see it both ways. And that's probably why it's such a popular topic for me. It's like I said, everybody has issues with this. And a lot of it they'll say is, we have some personality problems, or, somebody will call and say, I have an issue because I have a lot of people who are now in managerial positions who were probably previously they were with their peers and now they're managing them, or now they're managing people who are older. And I'll say, well, give me an example of what happened. And so one of the stories was a woman who was a manager. She had hired, how she describes it, young hotshot, which I'm sure older people do say that, oh, he's just a young hotshot kid or whatever. But he was a young hotshot kid. He knew his stuff. Well, he wanted to have a meeting with her. And so since one of the things millennials are tagged with is that the world doesn't happen fast enough for them, much like me when I was that age, they want things fast, 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 right? So he just would walk in her office like all the time. Whenever he needed anything, he would just walk by, kind of throw a question at her, and then he'd walk away. And so she had talked with her manager and HR saying, I can't deal with this kid. And they're like, oh, he's so bright. He's got so many great ideas. And she's like, don't care. I don't care about any of that. I care about how he's interrupting me during my workday, and I'm trying to focus on things, and he thinks I'm just there for him whenever he needs help. And he said, well, I don't think it's that. And we do have an open door policy. Well, what it came down to was when I came in to consult that company and that office in particular, I just got them both in the room and we talked about what their wants and needs were as far as that scenario specifically. So what it came down to, well, young hotshot kid, experienced manager, she basically said, I just really need you to schedule a time to see me. She's like,
Yeah.
send me an email. Now everybody has calendars out there, right?
Yeah.
Just find a space on my calendar. I think you did that to me, Brian. I was like, when do you want to get together? Because I'm old school. And you were like, here's my calendar. So, that has been new, last 5 years or so. So she's
Yeah.
like, just find a time on my calendar so I can focus on what you're saying
Yeah.
and asking of me. You might think you need to know right now, but I'm not going to be any good to you when you're just bopping in and out and I'm not prepared for our conversation. And
Yeah.
he was like, I am so sorry. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. That makes a lot of sense to me. I just know that you have the answers, somewhat complimenting her. I know you have the answers. So I was hoping I could just swing by, not take much of your time. And it's
Yep.
really all about communication, which
Right.
is the number one problem in the workforce today.
True story across all the generations. And you
True
talked
story.
about the story. For
Yeah.
me, this is a personal story for me as well. I'll never forget when I started my career, I was the young hotshot manager that you're talking about. I got promoted up pretty quickly, and I'll never forget that I was transferred to Boca Raton, Florida, which, if you're familiar, is certainly got its stereotypes for some of the older generation settling there after retirement. And I was 22 years old, and my whole staff at the store was in their 60s or older. I think maybe a couple were in their 50s. Everybody else was 60s. So many of them had grandkids that were approaching my generation or my age. And walking in there, I'll never forget when they said, I want you to sit down and do performance meetings with these. It was a sales job. It was at a City Furniture, Ashley Furniture store. And so the staff was there and I was the showroom manager. And my gosh, you mean I'm going to sit down and these people are going to laugh me out of the store if I'm going to tell them what to do or how to do. And so it's that managing people that are older than you, especially people that are a generation or more older than you. That's something that a lot of folks have to face, but until you do it, it's a challenge and it can be intimidating. So I want to give some real practical answers to that because I learned the hard way, and I want to do it from two different lenses. Let's start first from the lens of informally. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you're put in charge of a project or you're put in charge of some kind of effort at work. And some of the people who are on that effort are older than you. Let's start out with the scenario where you are not their boss. You do not have any authority over them. You really are coming to them. You're trying to get something done as the team lead for whatever this effort is. What do you say to that person who's coming into that situation?
If you want somebody's full attention and respect, you need to realize that that your rights kind of end where theirs begin. I mean, you have to come to a mutual agreement on how to communicate. And that is the basis for really any generation working together. So what I would say to you as somebody who would be doing that is that you would need to just set up time to have a conversation and ask a lot of questions. If you walk away from anything after this podcast, realize that if you ask questions as opposed to making statements, it comes off a lot softer. It comes off a lot more open-minded rather than you just stating, here's what we need to do. We need to work, we need to meet 3 times a week. I need it to be between 5 and 7, and going on, you're just basically telling them what to do. There's no interpersonal communication. So I would tell you, you need to go and talk to that person and say, let's talk about what's going to work best. How do you like to be communicated with? I mean, there's only 800 different ways that we can communicate with each other now, right? I mean, some people sit next to each other at work, but still email. We really need to talk more, but I understand that that's not always feasible. But say, I just want you to go to my calendar to set this up. I would prefer you call me and we find a time. I would prefer you email me several different times that we could have the first meeting for this project, or I prefer you go through my secretary. I prefer to do projects first thing in the morning. I want to make sure I get them in my day, and then I'll do my own work afterwards. There are so many different choices that if you communicate with that other person right from the beginning, and find out the foundation of how this is going to work, that is going to be the best for you. And you have to be open-minded, because if you ask a question, you have to be willing to adjust to the answer, or else you might as well be making statements. Like if you're thinking, well,
Yep.
I'm only going to work on this Monday night, so I'm going to tell them we're going to work on Monday nights. Well, you can't go into it and say what day works for you because Monday's the only day works for you, right? So
Right.
if you can be as flexible as possible, as open-minded as possible, that is the best way to form that foundation for any type of project or anything that is happening in the workplace. So that's step one, for sure.
I think you kind of tie into one of the notes that I made for myself was to build rapport and show respect for that person, because the reality
Yes.
is in many of
Yes.
these scenarios we're talking about, they're going to have more experience than you. So trying to come in and be an expert over them is really not going to get you anywhere, because they know and you know that they've got more experience than you do. Now, that doesn't mean that they're better at it than you. You might be better at it than them, but they've got more experience.
Right.
So acknowledging that experience and saying things like, I really appreciate your thoughts, can go a long way. And find that the other thing
Yes.
too with this is, remember that you're on the same team. In this scenario, it's an informal, you're the lead of the project, but you have no authority over them. So in this case, if you look at it like the two of you
Right.
are sitting on the same side of the table and you're both looking at the project together, side by side next to each other, you can use words like us and we need to do this, we need to do that, maybe this is our effort, and you're kind of in it together. That will probably go a long way toward that, the
Mm-hmm.
sort of underlying tone here, which is build that rapport and show respect for them that they're bringing to the table too.
I love the point about saying us and we. That's great. And I think so we know we're going to establish that foundation at first. And then as we move on, it is so important to involve those people, because whatever you are feeling that this is making you anxious, you have to almost assume they're feeling the same way. Because I know I've said that before. Like if I go and I'm on a committee and it's the first meeting and we go in there and I look around and maybe I'm the only woman. Maybe I'm the oldest there. Maybe I'm the only one that doesn't have, this side of experience or this type of degree. We all come in with that little bit of anxiety about what is going to happen. So don't ever assume or be intimidated by somebody who's older, because chances are they're feeling the same way. And that's something that we need to remember too. So we got to have the open communication. Don't be intimidated by someone. Try and involve different people. If you see it, if it's, let's say 4 people are on your committee and somebody's just not talking, my fault on that, which I've had to learn about myself over the years, is that I am a talker, of course. I would think that people who weren't contributing and weren't talking maybe weren't interested, or just wanted to be on this committee to say they were on a committee but didn't really want to do anything. I had this kind of unconscious bias that I've had to work on to just know, and I find myself in meetings, I'll say, Jenny, you haven't said anything yet. What are your thoughts on this? And then it's usually something profound because they've been such a good listener, while the rest of the people are just listening to talk. They might be the one that's actually listening to have a great opinion about what's happening. And that could be of any age, of course. But again, establish that foundation. Don't be intimidated, and make sure, if you are the lead, like you said, that you are involving all the people, because you're going to be asked what they're contributing to it. And
Yeah.
so for you to say, well, I don't know, they don't say anything, kind of falls on you. You need to keep track of it.
True. And I want to yes and you on this one. Yes, that's true. And one of the big mistakes that especially young and outgoing folks, or even folks that are just younger than the people they're working with, sometimes people are a little more introverted. And in order to get anything out of an introvert, you have to pause long enough to let them speak, and you have to not interrupt them when they're speaking, because they will get to the point and they have some really great points. But as an introvert, they're not going to compete with you. If you're a little more extroverted, they're not going to compete with you for the mic. They're going to let you have it every
Right.
time. And so if you want from them, you have to give them the space to get in there, and they definitely will. So make sure you give them that space. And what that means is, after you ask them a question, pause and let them answer don't fill the space. Just pause. Let it happen. Now,
That is a very good point.
one other.
I need to tell you this before I forget,
Yeah.
because my memory's short, right? I'm older, so I have to tell you this. So as part of my executive recruiting, and I'm talking to people, I have a little acronym that I have on my computer. And it's easy to use now for people because so many meetings are on Zooms. So nobody's going to see it. But it's WAIT, wait, right? And I learned this way back when I was studying to become a coach. And it stands for, why am I talking? Because sometimes I feel like I need to stop because somebody else needs to get a word in here. I might have the best idea, but I really need to realize, am I talking too much when I'm trying to draw and motivate and energize others? Like you said, you need to give them the space to talk as well.
Yep. I like that. Wait. Remember, why am I talking? Gosh, and I might borrow that at some point in the future. That's gold right there. I love that a lot.
You can have it.
Put
free and clear.
Put that sign on my laptop. That's a good one. And in that same vein, one of the other notes I made to myself is leverage their strengths. There's a book called Strengths Finder 2.0, or like strengths-based leadership. This idea that, meet people where their strengths are. And I think for the older generation, that is definitely true. I feel like when I say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, that's just making excuses for stuff that's no longer valid. I don't buy into that phrase. However, as you're dealing with a much older generation, finding the things that they are really good at, feel confident at, like to do, especially if you are in a situation where you don't have any formal authority over them, then leveraging your team with their strengths is going to be much easier to get more out of them, because you're not asking for them to do something new or something different. Go for the things that they're good at, leverage their strengths, and see, how have you approached similar challenges in the past? They might have approached some of these things before, but draw on their experience and draw on their strengths when you're in those groups with them.
And one of the problems with that and in bringing that out of people is that a lot of times you'll hear, well, that's how we always do it. That's how we've always done it. I mean, how many of us have heard that in the workplace? And we just want to scream. When you're younger, you just want to scream because you're like, well, that's dumb. But that doesn't sound obviously very professional. I have a filter now that maybe I didn't have at one point. I would have been, why are we doing that? But and it's important though, because people who are older and have been loyal are more likely the ones to say that because they've had success. A story of when you're going through new computers and new computer training and new programs, and everybody who is not really savvy hates those days at work, right? I mean, I remember we've come so far and everything that we've changed with computers, but you have to learn the whole new system. Those are horrible days for people who are older and just, are fine with what's in there. Like they just don't, why are we spending all this money on updating the computer? It's fine. Well, I said that 20 years ago, look where we are now. So then you have somebody who's young and quick and really understands it and is savvy. And they'll be like, well, let me just show you. And the chicka, and it's already done. See, that's a quick way to do it. And I had a client in that scenario, and he said, you know what? You have found a very fast way to do that. And I appreciate how far this has come because you're going to make a real difference in this company. He said, but if something goes wrong, you don't really know all the steps that it takes to get there because you found a shortcut. What I need you to respect and understand is the long way, so that if something doesn't work, you can probably go back and fix it or figure out where to tweak it. Where when you just take your shortcuts, you don't really have any idea. And I think that's a really good point. When you are dealing with somebody older, they probably know the history of things, whereas you might be saying, well, this is faster, we should do it this way, then we can meet our deadlines, move on to another project. But the older people are like the ones that are that school teacher that needed you to show all your work. And you didn't understand why, because you got the answer right. You're like, why do I need to show you when I know the answer? And the teacher would say, what? I need to know that you know how to get there. And that's important to older
True story.
generations. My father, one of them, when he would buy me a bike, I had to know how it was put together. It was always a Schwinn. When I was little, because they ranked first in Consumer Reports. I was probably the only 5-year-old on the block that knew my bike ranked first on Consumer Reports. So it is the same type of thing. Older generations, people who've been around, people who are loyal, will have much more respect for you, and hopefully vice versa, if you understood how you got the answer, because that's what they're looking for.
Let's step up to formally now. Let's say now you've been promoted. You are the supervisor. You're the first round supervisor, the second round supervisor. You have people underneath you on the org chart that report to you that also are older than you. So how does that change the dynamics? What advice do you have there, Ann?
As I was thinking about this prior to talking with you, I'm looking through and researching again, older generations, things I've talked about probably over the last 10 years as I'm speaking. And there are just a few things we need to tweak just for the older generations, but mostly it's how we should treat anybody. So if you're looking at, well, I got to learn a whole new way to treat somebody, why? Why? Just because they're older? Not necessarily. If you approach them with the same type of respect that you would one of your peers, you probably aren't going to have issues. So now that it's formal and you're the supervisor, the same thing is finding and having that communication right out of the gate. Because if you just wait until it comes up or wait until there's an issue, which so many managers do, it's a big mistake. You don't want the first time that you meet somebody, talk to them face to face, maybe share a laugh about something, to be when you have to call them in because something is wrong. You'd want to have that foundation, as you said, getting to know them a little bit, have some kind of communication, some type of respect, just a foundation to talk to them and know where they're coming from, know what their goals are. I was actually coaching somebody who this is the exact same scenario, and he brought the person in who was older, and he said to them, let's start from the beginning. I mean, first of all, your record looks impeccable. Thank you for being so loyal. You're the type of person that I hope we all can be, kind of just, complimented him over and over. And he's like, what are your career goals? And the guy was honest. And he said, I've been here a really long time and everything keeps changing. I really see myself probably retiring. And instead of being like, oh, I don't have to deal with this guy, he was like, well, we want to make sure that we retain all your knowledge, everything you've got before you decide on that time. Whereas maybe somebody else would have said, okay, well, thanks for letting me know. We'll keep, want to make this great. Let me know if HR can help you with that or when you want to leave. That would be just a horrible thing to do when you have this gold mine of information right in front of you. And you don't know where that's going until you ask. Going back to asking questions. So for the question, when you are now the supervisor, immediately have that conversation. Be open-minded to what they are going to say. Establish that type of respect. And one thing that I find that really, really works is ask them if they'd be interested in mentoring someone. Now we have basically said, in not so many words, I value you. I know you know what you're doing. You've been here a long time. You have great experience. You're somebody I trust. Would you mind mentoring somebody who's coming up in the ranks? but all you've had to do is ask, will you mentor? And you've covered all those other compliments. I do not know one person who would not feel great about being asked that, even if they feel they're overwhelmed and they don't know if they want to do it and that sort of thing. They know they're appreciated. And you get the most out of people by letting them know they are appreciated. So that also should be part of your first conversation. And if you don't have a mentoring program right now, why not? It really helps people. And another hint is that the best mentors skip a generation. It's almost like it's a grandparent type mentoring rather than, somebody who's in the generation right above you, because there can be conflict, right? That's child and parent conflict. Everybody has a conflict sometimes with their parents. But if you skip a generation, when you're finding mentors, you will find it to be much more successful. So supervising, informal or formal, have those conversations right away.
Often in the older generations, you are looking back, you're looking down, you're reflecting on your early career and your early days. Many of the folks that are of the older generation can remember the days when they were the younger generation. And oftentimes they have some really good tips. And so for if you're managing older folks, one of my favorite phrases that I like to say is, I look at my career like I am learning by committee. And what I mean by that is, I look at it like you have something to learn from each of those people, each of those mentors. So don't just have one, go find 6 grandparent age people that are way older than you, or mentor much older mentors, and learn from them. And in the very first, it's funny, in the first episode of this podcast ever, if you've never heard it, I actually tell the story about where learning by committee comes from. And it's a quick 5-minute story, but it's just such a profound thing about how you can learn from different folks. So that leveraging the mentors in a way of getting knowledge from multiple people helps you level up so much faster by gaining from that experience. And honestly, they're probably going to enjoy it. They wouldn't agree to kind of mentor you, even formally or informally, even if you don't have a mentor program. They wouldn't agree to do it if they didn't want to do it. So that's a really good point. I like that one, Ann.
And a lot of times people will come, well, how do we retain our employees? I do recruiting as well. And well, how do we keep people? And so many people are having a hard time in the workforce right now with people retiring, especially healthcare, nurses retiring. And one of the things I'll ask is, do you have a mentor program? Do you have people connecting with each other and feeling a sense of community? And I know, some corporations are like, I don't, that's just nothing I do. We don't really do that. But I will tell you, it makes a huge difference. And you're not wasting money on training and then they're leaving. I mean, you are keeping people there who want to be there. And once you have that respect between generations, I mean, that is just a huge hurdle to everybody getting along. And the only way to do that, like you said, is to have a lot of different mentors. You might learn something great from hopefully most, if not all of them, but you might also learn how not to treat people, because I have been in those environments as well, where I'm like, if I was a manager, I would never talk to somebody like that, or I would never, close the door on them, or whatever the scenario was. And I have to tell you, that's helped me just as much as the good bosses and managers have, for sure.
And that leads right into one of my thoughts that I had on this topic. When you're formally in there, one of the mistakes that I watched a lot of other young managers make is they asserted their position during the day-to-day. Even if it was informally or offhanded, they would remind people that I'm your boss, I'm your whatever, your supervisor. Here's the deal. They know that you're their boss. So there's no reason to rub their face in it, and like you never have to say it ever, because they know it and you know it. And so they know that you're the boss technically, but the reality is, we talked about, earning their respect and stuff. You're not going to tell them by starting something with, well, because I'm your boss, I'm going to do something. That's never going to get you any further than it would have otherwise. That doesn't help. It actually hurts in a lot of scenarios. So instead, earlier we talked about using the terms us and we. Talk about how you work with them. If you ever meet their family, or you meet their friends, or you meet their somebody, if they introduce you as their boss, that's cool. But if you meet them, all you say is, hey, I work with such and such, and they're so good, or they're great at their job, or whatever. You work with them. We never need to talk about the fact that you're the boss. Because if it ever comes up in a situation where it needs to be there, it's already understood.
Right. And those, quite honestly, are some ugly conversations. If it has to be started with because I'm your boss, or because I make the big bucks, or whatever they want to say, they're demeaning you right away to start that. Who wants to start a conversation like that? I say the same thing.
True.
If you are somebody that has to announce yourself, then you don't have the kind of respect that you probably need to be in that position. And unfortunately, people who are really, really good at their job, like physically doing whatever their job may be, does not mean that they're going to be a good manager, because they don't take classes in college called, dealing with difficult people 101, or dealing with older people who I don't agree with, at the 200 level. I mean, there's nothing like that. And that's where you're going to have the most problems. I know you're great at your job and you got promoted. Good for you. But if you don't treat me like a human being, I am not going to want to work here. And what you need to realize is that the number one reason that people leave their jobs is not because of money. It's not because they haven't been promoted. It is because of their immediate supervisor. So when you take over that position and you are now the immediate supervisor of people who are older than you, and you are saying that's a problem, you are having a direct impact on their career, on their life. And as we talked about, we're looking for mentors. We're looking for ways. I mentioned the gentleman who said, well, I'm just going to retire. So now you have somebody who's under you. You know where their mind is. They want to know the company's solid. They want to know they're getting their 401k. I mean, they are coming to work for a whole different reason than the 20-year-old who's under you, who's like, I'm probably just going to be here for 3 years, and then I want to move on to bigger and better. If we're lucky, if the company's even lucky, people switch so often now. So you've got loyalty, and you have to know how to manage that at the same time as you have new people who want the best and want to move on. And that's difficult for you. You have to learn how to do that, because that's what makes a really good manager. And being empathetic for both ends of that spectrum is at the top of that list for sure.
And while we're on this topic, one of the things that came to mind for me was your authority in their eyes is a job function and job description, not because you're better than them. I flash back on in my scenario where I was the showroom manager, and I was in this store with folks that had been doing it much longer than I do and were older than I was. And the reality was, by the numbers, according to those metrics, I was better than them. However, even though the numbers might say that, people of the older generation will still not believe it. They will still not think it in many cases. But here's the key. You are no longer doing their job with them. Your job is to be the supervisor now. So your job changed. So just because you were at one point better than them and got promoted, if you're in that position above them and you are very good at doing their job now you got a different job. So don't go back and do their job. I think that's a huge mistake, is people try to be better at the job than the people that they supervise, when the reality is everybody wins if you're better at being the supervisor and getting your goals met from the team, instead of just because you could do it better than they could.
Right. And let's be honest, being a manager or a supervisor of older people, not easy. Of younger people, not easy. Of people the same age, not easy. None of it is easy. So you cannot blame this on, well, they're older and they don't listen to me, and, they don't respect me because I'm younger, because it's not easy no matter what. And you know what? The people who are older, who are upset that you got promoted because maybe they're on their way out, who knows why, that wasn't their decision. So shame on them. Seriously, that is nothing you need to worry about. because I'll hear that a lot too. Well, they're all upset because I got this job and they didn't and they wanted it and stuff. That's their issue. And you can't do anything about it. If they want to take that up with the hiring people, the HR people, they can do that. And if it gets to the point where you have to have a conversation about it, so be it. Because I even said I was in a scenario where somebody else wanted the job and I came in and I got it. And when I arrived there, everybody was mad because they all wanted this other person to get the job. So they were less than friendly because, they wanted to obviously make this other person feel good. And I had to get to the point where I was like, I can't take that on. I'm not going to turn down a job or turn down a promotion to better my family because somebody else wanted it who was, older or more experienced. They didn't get it. So you cannot do anything about that type of criticism. So you know what? Do not even try. That's their problem. It's not your problem. And you would be better to just ignore it all for sure and move forward with what you believe were the reasons you got the job, because everybody's told, right? They probably told you, I am giving you this promotion because I believe that you have, great ideas for our future. I think you have the educational background with, new technology that others don't have. I need you to share that. You need to remember the reason you were hired and focus on those things. Just like you said earlier, Brian, people need to remember what they bring to the table so they can focus on those things. People stay in their lanes and everybody is a lot happier. And if they want to improve, great. But to take things out on each other because of politics, it's a bad idea.
Totally agree. No, and we've been talking a lot about many of these points. And, if you go back and listen, and I didn't tell you what the topic was today, many of the bits of advice that we gave would probably apply to older people managing younger people too. So let's hone in specifically kind of in a rapid fire way. I had a few ideas that I was thinking about that are very specific to younger people managing older generations. And I think you started it off great with the make an appointment versus just drop in. Older generation likes you to make an appointment, and the younger generation is fine with you just dropping in. And my counter to that is I think that's true of the younger generation, unless it's a formal or a very important discussion, then they're probably going to appreciate the appointment as well so they can prepare for it. But for anything that's not preparation is not needed, I think they would drop in. So I think that's a good starting point. What else comes to mind for you on specifically for younger folks managing the older generation?
Well, I think it is really important that, yes, we did say that, these are tangibles that you can take away. Okay. You need to obviously make those appointments. You need to be open-minded about talking to them. You need to find out what their strengths are, what their career goals are. You might think they are going to retire in a year or two and that they have no intention of doing that. You can then obviously ask them if they want to mentor, as we talked about as well. That makes it feel inclusive. That makes them feel valued. That might not be, that is something different. You probably wouldn't ask a really young person to do that. Make sure then that mentorship even skips a generation, as we talked about. And at the very end of the day, give them the respect that you would want in return. It's more important probably with the older generation because you are sort of bucking all the things they've learned and you might want them to erase it all and start over. So you're asking a lot of people. And I've had a lot of people who are in hiring position, they'll want to hire someone younger and they'll say, because then I can teach them how to do it right. They don't want to hire somebody older because they're going to have to teach them over again. But then you're losing out on so much by looking at it that way. So be open-minded, be respectful, do the appointments, do the mentorship. It's not just the older generation that makes it difficult. It's just human beings in generation. We can be difficult.
Absolutely. And, I've got 3 ideas that I want to bounce off you, Ann. As I was thinking about this one, 3 things came to mind for me. One, as the younger generation, one of the things you need to avoid is any of the latest trends, segregation that can happen. And what I mean by that is let them opt out of whatever that conversation is, but don't opt them out. So what I mean by that is, like, let's say you're talking about Snapchat or Be Real or one of these brand new apps that all the young kids are using these days. Instead of, sometimes I've heard younger folks say, oh, well, this is what the young folks are doing these days. And you say it in a way that kind of but verbally wants to butt these people out because they're older, so they're not going to be interested. Instead, start to explain it to them. Be like, they said, oh, what's Be Real? And you can be like, instead of, oh, you wouldn't know younger, you could say, well, it's a new app where you take photos, and be real about what's happening right then. Have you ever used it before? And ask them, and then let them be the one to say, I'm not into that stuff, or I don't believe in social media. And they're probably going to get on the negative train and tell you all the reasons why they don't like it and whatever. But what's important is that you, as the young person, didn't tell them that they're too old. Don't do that. That's the mistake, I think.
Right.
For them. So that was one. My next one was start out addressing them with the Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. title when you first meet them and first work with them. And that's a respect thing. So if you're working with Ben Smith, if the guy's name is Ben Smith, you start out calling him Mr. Ben or Mr. Smith, and you stick with that until they say, you can call me Ben, or you can call me, until they change it from you. Just use that as your default mode, is use that Mr. or Miss title, because let them be the one to kind of make that selection. And that seems like such an insignificant thing, but that establishes that respect we were talking about when earlier we said build rapport and show respect. That starts out showing the respect right up front. Even if what you're going to say isn't nice or isn't good news, you still give them that respect of Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. Any thoughts on that one, Ann? Have you come across that at all?
Well, you know what you'll get on that, though. You know what you'll get when you do that.
What's that?
You'll say, and you'll get this because people, I've heard it before. They'll say, okay, Mr. Smith. And they'll say, I'm not Mr. Smith. My dad was Mr. Smith. Like they find it almost like you're already saying you're old, because you wouldn't say Mr. Smith to the 20-year-old, so they're, because even when I go somewhere and they'll say, ma'am, I'm like, ma'am, really? Do I look like ma'am? Because my grandma was ma'am, and I know it's trying to be nice, and I appreciate you saying it, Brian, but I think you should be consistent with that. Like, if you're not going to say it to somebody younger, you probably don't need to say it to somebody older, because by segregating that just to older people, you're basically telling them they're older. Something to think about.
That's a really good point. Well, then it makes sense to ask them what they would prefer to be called. What would you like me to call you? Is it, because sometimes it's a name pronunciation. You need to pronounce their name right anyway. So, hey, Ben? Is it Ben? Right. Should I call you Ben? And that's to everybody. That's a good point.
And that's where we go with asking questions. At the beginning of this, I said, if you learn nothing else from this whole conversation, is to just ask questions. Don't assume what they want to be called. Don't assume what their goals are at work. Don't assume that they're on their way out. Don't assume that they don't want to know what Be Real is. Ask questions. True. And it's so much more engaging than just making those statements. My dad was a judge, and it was John Kerian. And you would, people say, well, I call you John. Do I call you Mr. Kerian? And he'd be like, no, call me Judge. You just never know. So you might as well ask. Yeah,
that's a good point. And my last little thought was about tech gaps. And you mentioned new technology earlier, Anne, and this is one where I personally feel like it's no longer acceptable to say, I don't like computers, or I'm not good with technology, because the reality is it's not going anywhere. Yeah. So if saying that is kind of a defeatist thing, right. I don't think that's good. However, respecting the fact that people need training and time to learn these new skills, you can't look down at your nose at somebody just because they don't immediately pick up the app or whatever the latest software is that you're bringing in, or they don't get it. So start with the training and give people a chance to do the training and really try it first, and save that assumption of, they're older, they're not going to get it. Save that until they prove you right by having the training, and then they still aren't able to get it. What do you think about the tech gap thing?
Yeah, it is a quick way to insult somebody. Honestly, I have 2 kids. My older boys are in their 20s, and they'll be like, Mom, just don't touch it. Just let me show you, and they'll get really aggravated with me if I ask certain questions, or they'll say, well, I've told you how to do this before. And I was like, stop. I taught you how to use a spoon. So give me some little relief here that I don't quite understand this as quickly as you do. And so,
Yeah.
and that's a meme, by the way. I can't take credit for that one, but it's just very important because it is somewhat insulting because you're basically saying that they're old because you're
Yeah.
like, well, I'm sure you haven't heard of this, or I bet you don't know how to do this. And I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I think new things and new programs are hard for a lot of different people. And I hear I'm not tech savvy from a lot of people. And I think I even say it myself. But when I'm doing it, I know what I'm saying is I'm not tech savvy, meaning don't skip steps. Like don't say, okay, well, when you get to that place, you just click on whatever, click on C. Well, what you didn't tell me is that I should obviously know that when I get there, there's a drop down menu that then leads to my name that leads, you skip a lot of
Right.
steps when you
Yeah.
think somebody understands. And I guess that goes back to what we're talking about is that we're the old teachers that want to know how you got to where you got. And if you have to look at older generations, does anybody think of that? Would your teacher just be okay with you saying, yeah, well, here's your laptop, good luck? No. And the best places for learning training, then the best things that I've had is they provide you with a template. If we've learned nothing about society, it's that we're all so different, and that neurodiversity is talked about all the time. We all learn differently. Don't just expect me to go home and read a book and do it, because I might learn better if I come in and I hear somebody, or I might learn better by watching. So keep in mind that not only are you teaching people who are older, but you're teaching people who are different in learning styles. And to be a good manager, to have a good company, you have to realize what the differences there are too. Like I said, not easy. You've got a lot of
Yeah.
different people and a lot of different learning abilities and ages that you're responsible for.
Yeah. And let's switch gears here, because you've shared a lot of these really good stories, and I'm curious, what does this mean, this topic area, what does this mean for you personally? Is there a story there on that?
Well, personally, I see people who are not keeping their jobs, or they're not getting a job because now they feel they are too old. Now, there is an example. I was consulting for a bank, and one of the women that they found out after a while, she was transposing the numbers. Okay. I do that every once in a while. Scares me to death when it happens. I'm like, oh my gosh, I wrote the phone number down wrong, or whatever it is. Never had those thoughts when I was younger. So it's very scary. But obviously somebody like that, that's not going to work. But to be in a work environment and ignore those who have that type of knowledge that they can bring and share with others, it is so self-satisfying to help somebody else. When I was living in Florida and I worked at the television station there, I was probably 6 years into my career. And on the weekends, I anchored the weekends, and I had the opportunity to. I didn't have to. I raised my bar to this. I would take care of the interns from the University of West Florida. We're in Pensacola. And I loved it. And those interns now, I mean, one of them is this accomplished author. She's on national TV doing crime stories. She's amazing. Some of the others are still in television. Others went on and became lawyers. I mean, there's a part of them part of me that will always cheer for them. And so if you're young and you think you're just going in to battle people that are older and they don't want you there, that is not true. And maybe they're a little jealous, right? Life goes too fast. I had an opportunity where I worked with a law firm, and the woman that I coached, they thought she was miserable there. But after coaching her and getting down to the bottom of it and the crux of it, she was just jealous. She was like the oldest one there. She couldn't go out with everybody. She'd always hear them talking, and she did not feel part of that community. She didn't feel part of that work family, which we spend more time with our work family than we do our own family. And she didn't feel part of it. So then we did somewhat of a mentoring program where she would have, coffee once a week with one of the younger staff, kind of, fill them in on how things have worked over the years, listen to their opinions. And it was a beautiful relationship. So I guess I feel strongly about this conversation because I know it can work. I know people can work together, and I would never want somebody to lose a job or not get a job just because of their age, despite what laws say, you can get around those. It still happens. Um,
Yeah.
at least I think it does. And so I just would never really want that to be the case. I don't want people to give up on people.
And on this topic, are there any other resources that you would recommend when it comes to, managing people that are older than you?
Well, I certainly would talk to your HR and use that human resources person as a huge resource. They are being updated on the most statistics about people in the workforce, what we can do to help them, what we can do to help all different kinds of people. I mean, just, we have everything at our fingertips. Go in and Google and say, how do I work with an older person? You can type, how do I work with an older person who drives me crazy? And you'll probably get like 10 pages of stuff. There are tons of resources out there. You just have to look. And it certainly doesn't take long in this day and age, as you all know, because you all know, technology better than we do.
Yeah. And well, I agree with that. And I'll drop any resources that I have. I'll drop those in the show notes and some of the things. And, Anne, you mentioned one of the things I am going to put in the show notes that I think is helpful is the different generations. Sometimes we assume that everybody knows what year everybody is, but what is Generation X? What is the millennials? What is the, these things? I think that's really important to actually specify that. So please open up your show notes and take a look at that too, so that you're clear on this. And the yes and I want to do for you, and I love what you said, is find those resources. And my yes and is, yes, do that, and find the resources that are in the format that you're going to like. Because, for example, I'm an audio guy. So if I can find podcasts or audiobooks that are on this topic, I am more likely to pick those up than I am blogs, or especially books that you would have to read a physical copy of. So whatever your flavor is, find the resources that are your flavor, because they're going to be, you're much more likely to actually use those. And you, like I said, it's learning by committee. So you're not looking for the one gold nugget to rule them all. You're looking to learn a little bit from this episode, and maybe there's other podcast episodes. Like, use those resources, but learn by committee and get something from all of those resources.
I 100% agree. I could tell you it's in this book and that book, but if you're not a reader, it's not going to be interesting to you. 100%.
And here's what I love. I love that you have spent so much time working with folks and coaching people on this topic. And really, clearly, it comes from a personal experience and a personal love, and you've managed to transpose that into business and working with your clients. I love the personal stories that you bring to this thing. And I really appreciate you sharing some of those little nuggets with us here today, because I think it's even if many of the things that we talked about today, people, you listening probably might have heard that once before, but sometimes you got to hear it a few times, even though you already knew it. And so this was great. So Anne, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I am honored to be on your podcast. So I wish you out there all the best. And I really thank you, Brian, for the opportunity.
Yeah. And if they want to find you or keep in touch with you online somewhere, where should they go?
They should go to my website. Is probably the easiest, which is just AnnKerian.com. AnnKerian.com. I will be very attentive and responsive, and I would love to hear from you.
For you tuning in, do you have a friend or a colleague who manages people older than them? If so, would you share this link to this episode specifically with them? Because I know Anne and I would love to know that our conversation touched people that are actually facing this exact scenario. And I know there are a lot of folks who are facing this scenario. So it would be such a wonderful thought and not to mention the interesting conversation you can have with them, because everybody who's managed people older than them, some of the best stories I've had with coworkers have been about this topic right here. Oh my gosh, that I shared with you, that showroom and the folks that were significantly older than me and managing those folks, man, some of those conversations are really good ones, whether it's funny or tearful or whatever it is. The conversation you can have from sharing this episode with them might be really fun. So I hope you'll do that and share this episode. And Thanks for liking and subscribing. And I do a lot with my email list, so join in on that fun if you want to get in on some of the best of what I send out. And if I can help you or your team with incredibly practical tips leveling up your productivity, please reach out. Together, we're going to change your life. That's a wrap.
Productivity. Gladiator.